Welcome to the Division of Local Services webinar relative to the role of the assessor. My name is Jennifer McAllister, and I support training initiatives here at DLS. Before we get started, I want to remind participants that this webinar will be recorded and posted on the DLS YouTube channel for future reference. The PowerPoint presentation will also be shared along with any links referenced. Please submit your questions using the question and answer function on the menu bar, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. Today's presentation will be led by BLA Bureau Chief Christopher Wilcock.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Appreciate the introduction and very happy to talk about today the role of the assessor. So as far as just a little background, I'm the Bureau Chief of Local Assessment at DLS. Before coming to DLS, I've had 2 decades as a municipal assessor in 5 different communities, serving as a full-time assessor, a board member, and even an elected board member. So DLS is responsible for ensuring fairness in local property taxation. The Bureau of Local Assessment is responsible for regulations, oversight, training, and technical assistance to cities and towns for all public officials for valuation or anything related to assessing. Each community has an advisor assigned to them. So at BLA, there is 12 valuation professionals that roughly have 30 communities assigned to them. They should be your point of contact. And if there's any specific questions after this webinar, please feel free to follow up with your BLA advisor. So what is assessing in Massachusetts? Assessing in Massachusetts is dictated by Mass General Law. So if you're looking for just a summary in Mass General Law Chapter 59, Section 2 states that all property is taxable unless expressly exempt. So what does that mean? It starts with every piece of property, whether it's personal property, real estate, everything is taxable. And then if you look at certain sections in Mass General Law, it will start to exempt certain things like furniture and fixtures in your primary residence. There's certain things that are exempt from taxation, but in general, everything starts as taxable. So as far as taking Mass General laws and kind of putting it into language that's a little easier, so assessors are tasked with creating a property tax roll annually. They maintain what's called a CAMA database, which is a very extensive database of property characteristics. And what they do every year is they're constantly adding, changing, and reviewing all of the information that's in there. So things like property sales, building permits, changes in zoning, maybe splits in property for development, all of that is tracked annually, and that is the job of the assessor. So as far as the role, the assessor has a couple different things. I like to split the role of the assessor into 2 major categories. You have the administrative side, and then you also have the valuation side. On the valuation side, they're really trying to get the most accurate assessments to be used for the tax process or tax billing in a community. So a community puts together what they need for a budget. Based on local receipts, they determine what they can have for a levy under Prop 2.5. And then from there, that value is split to all the taxpayers. It's extremely important to have a fair and equitable system. Therefore, everyone has a fair share of the tax levy. The tax levy funds things like public safety, education, all different things that the city or town pays for in an annual year. And in order to make sure that everyone's tax bill is fair, it all starts with the assessment. So one of the things we're working on at the Bureau of Local Assessment is to define, based on numbers, what is assessing in Massachusetts. So this slide right here is something that just breaks it down a couple different ways. So assessing is done in 351 cities and towns. In total, we're looking at about 2.6 million valuations. So again, going back to our staff, we're talking about 12 advisors with some other support staff as well. In total, I think we'll exceed probably 1.9, but $1.9 trillion in assessed value is accounted for each year. That generates about $22 billion in annual tax levies across the Commonwealth each year. That work is done locally by 1,700 assessors or valuation professionals across the state. That could be anything from elected officials to full-time. It could be contract assessors or vendors, and it could also be clerical staff. So in Gateway, we have over 1,700 public officials that are assigned to the assessing function. In the Bureau of Local Assessment, we have, including myself, we have 17 assessment professionals. So we have the 12 advisors and supervisors assigned to communities. We have 4 project managers, and we have the bureau chief. So in order for 2.6 million valuations annually, we have 17 people at the Bureau of Local Assessment that help review all the market changes and valuation changes each year. As far as property in Massachusetts, it's mostly residential. So a lot of that is done by the sales analysis or the market approach to value. In a typical year, we're looking at roughly 114,000 property sales for all uses, but mostly residential or mostly single-family sales. And some of the numbers we're also trying to gather, and this is based on 2024 budgets, but in a combination in total, we have about $90 million that's spent on assessing, which includes that would include salaries, wages, contract services, pretty much all of the assessing budget as defined on the numbers we get reported from cities and towns. So that's a lot of money being spent on cities and towns in the assessment function. So as far as, just the role, a lot of people think it's just the valuing, but what I want to do is actually break out all the other things that have to happen before you can set your values, before you can really look at the market data. So a lot of these things are ongoing. So an assessor must identify and list all property. So for instance, if there's a new parcel, who owns the parcel? What is the use of the parcel? What is the land characteristics of the parcel? So, the size, the location, maybe some land influences like neighborhood. And then is there a building on it? And then once you list all that, you actually see if it's taxable or not taxable. But every property in a jurisdiction should kind of go through this process. The Division of Local Services requires every 10 years for every property to be relisted. So that's to ensure fair and accurate records that the assessments are built off of. Valuation is just putting a value as of the assessment date. There's many appraisal methodologies that we'll get into, but every year, all property must have a new value. In order to get those values and accurate values, the assessors are constantly, whether it's virtual, in the field, they're collecting data and they're analyzing that data. So for instance, the most common, 3 of the most common things are, going out in the field, so inspection data, looking at building permits, so that would be any growth data or any changes. And then a third one would be sales that come in. So there's a lot of information that comes in to an assessing office, and it has to be vetted before it's put in the system. If someone sells a house to a relative, that's not going to be used in sales analysis. And the assessors will be pulling that out of the system so that that does not impact values. There's multiple reasons why some sales would not be qualified, and the assessor is the one that actually goes through that. On the administration side, the assessors are also responsible for administering exemptions and abatements. So exemptions could be for seniors, for veterans, and other things expressed in Mass General laws. So there's a lot of guidance on that. They also administer the abatement process. The assessment and any valuation is an opinion of value. So there is a process in place called an abatement process for taxpayers to contest the values. And that's described in Mass General laws, and we have a lot of great guidance as far as how that's administered. The assessor also interacts with the public. A large portion of their job is spent explaining how valuations work, but also how the tax process works. So everyone sends out tax bills every year. There's an appeal process. So the assessor actually explains what the tax bill was, how it's calculated, all those different things the assessor does. They also explain any compliance, so anything as far as standards from DLS or standards that come out for a certification process. There's all those things. They also defend the assessments too. If a local board denies an appeal, that goes to the appellate tax board, and the assessor is tasked with either defending it themselves or hiring someone to work on that. So property types in Massachusetts are broken down to two major categories. You have real property and personal property. So real property would be anything with land and improvements on it. So that could be broken down to a residential property, which includes single families, condominiums, multifamilies, even residential land. You have commercial properties, and that could include retail, office, and industrial. You have, you have different classes. So there's 5 different classes of property, but this is again a very high level of what you're looking at. Under personal property, this is tangible items that are taxable. For instance, machine and equipment for businesses that are located in a jurisdiction. For some businesses, the inventory is taxed. And then there's also second home taxation. So there's a lot of personal property valuations that happen every year. This is just, again, a very high level. But again, we have a lot of information to break down all of these slides, and I'll go into kind of those resources later in this presentation. So let's start with market sales. So a lot of residential properties rely on sales activity and looking at, property sales in a given time period. For most communities, the single family type of property is the largest type of property, and that for the most part uses market sales to develop values. So what they'll look at is sales from a certain time period. They'll analyze what the properties are selling for over the previous assessed value, and they'll make adjustments to that value to bring it up to what properties are selling for today or on the assessment date. So the assessor is tasked with looking through, sometimes hundreds of sales in order to come up with a value for each property. So there's a limited sampling they have, but they apply those market sales to adjust residential properties and properties in their database each year. So here's an example of comparing colonial 3 bedrooms. So what adjustments might be made is there's a common misconception that there's always 2 identical properties. Sometimes they're slightly different. So the model that the assessors have in their office will actually value based on square footage. It could be based on building type, how many bathrooms, or the grade of construction. There's a lot of things that are baked in. So just because a sale comes in a certain neighborhood for a certain type of house, it doesn't mean you just take that and apply it to the model. There's a lot of work that the assessors do, and there's a lot of training that's required in order to administrate a market sales kind of approach. So in order to kind of explain that for anyone that's new to assessing, this is a very high level kind of explanation of what mass appraisal is. So assessors are tasked with assessing properties on a mass appraisal. So a model driven kind of approach compared to if you were to get a mortgage or if you were to get an appraisal where you hire an appraiser to go out, they find 3 comparable sales, and they have kind of a sales comparison report that they put together. So 2 drastically different kind of valuation methods. A single property appraisal could cost anywhere from, $250 to $400 for an, even higher than that for a single family. It could be a lot more for commercial properties, multis, industrial. Communities just don't have the resources to get an appraisal for each property every year. So what they do is they have these mass appraisal models that they test with market sales, cost information, income information every year. And what this model does is it applies a value to all the classes of properties. So this model is crucial to administering fair and equitable assessments. So anytime there's sales, anytime there's a change in income streams, whether it's rental information or whether it's expense information, anytime that there's major adjustments or fluctuations with costs of building materials, the assessors are tasked with adjusting the models. Every fifth year, the Department of Revenue comes into municipalities for a certification year. And what we do is we really start looking at the model and any adjustments that happened over the 4 years leading up to the cert. And we really get into the details to ensure that fair and equitable assessments are coming from the model. So I'm going to breeze over kind of the cost approach, but there are 3 different approaches to value. We have this really defined in our standards, and I'll provide those resources after this webinar. But cost is estimating value. This is used with new construction. It's one of the 3 approaches. But basically, you're looking at reproduction or replacement cost of a building minus depreciation plus the land value, and that generates kind of an estimated value. This is not that popular in Massachusetts based off of the age of the properties. If you have new construction, it's a lot easier, but trying to do this for a house that was built in the 17 or 1800s requires a lot of work. And looking at a mass appraisal model, we would look at some things, but this is not something that's used for residential properties a lot. So the income approach is used commonly, mostly for properties that have an income stream. For instance, retail, commercial, office buildings, apartment buildings. What you're doing is looking at income and expense that comes into the assessors every year. So with income information, there's a process that assessors go through. There's a lot of training outside the 101 that assessors go through in order to get certified either by the Association of Assessing Officers or the International Association of Assessing Officers. So they have a lot of income market cost kind of classes that assessors take, but using the income valuation model, they could have 2 or 3 or 4 different classes that are a week long just to deal with income. So you're looking at operating income, you're looking at things like capitalization rate, and you're looking at expense information. So this is, again, a very simplified way of looking at it. But assessors are tasked with the income approach on some of the properties that reside in their jurisdiction. So as far as setting values, the tax rate process, I think that for me coming to BLA, this was always an unknown. How long do things take? What is the process? What is the typical year? So I'm going to spend a little time on this only because what we're seeing is sometimes assessments are starting later and later in the year. So by law, you can start submitting your assessments on July 1st. But on the other side, you have to have your tax bills for the most part for quarterly tax billing out by December 31st. So that window right there seems like a lot of time. But what we're seeing is a lot of people submitting later in the year and kind of having a rushed or an abbreviated process for submitting the tax rate. And what we're trying to do is provide some insight for assessors to plan accordingly. So based on looking at multiple years and looking at different types of tax rate processes from the start of the fiscal year. So when the assessors submit their sales information, which is kind of the start of the process in Gateway. Gateway is a system that we use to have public officials submit financial information and assessment data to DLS. So from the start of that till the approved tax rate, we're looking at roughly 51 days for the average community. So that's the first step in Gateway until your approved valuation. There's a lot in between, and I'll go through that. For certification year, that's 66 days. So a certification year is a year that the Bureau of Local Assessment will be on premises. They'll be working to evaluate the model. So there's a lot more reporting that's in a certification year. There's roughly 70 communities that are in certification every year. And again, it's a deep dive to really understand what's happening in that model and what's happened in the last 4 years leading up to that certification. So if you look at the timeline here, this is going to go through an FY25 quarterly town. More than happy to provide some insight for semi-annual communities, but for this exercise, we'll look at a quarterly town. So property sales for FY25, if you had enough sampling, the year that you're looking at roughly is January 1st, 2023, ending December 31st, 2023. There's a certain percentage requirement of sales that we have. If you don't meet that percentage, you can add another year to the sales sampling. So it's not uncommon for smaller communities to have 2 years worth of sales compared to larger communities having only 1 year. So it depends on how many parcels you have and then the quantity of sales you have in a given year. So looking at the assessment date for fiscal 25, we're looking at calendar year 23 sales. Why don't we look at 24 sales? Because for fiscal 25, the assessment or the fiscal year started July 1st, 2024. So we don't have a full calendar year. So that's why we look at the calendar year in 2023, because the fiscal year starts July 1st, 2024. So going through after the sales, what you're going to look for is the growth date. So this is all the building improvements, change in use, anything that wasn't that's improved that wasn't taxed previously. So that could be change from a tax exempt to a taxable. It could be a new house, a development. It could be changes in the use of a property. Mainly what it is improvements to residential or commercial property. So new buildings, interior renovations, new sheds or outbuildings. All that is allowed to be captured. And depending on how your community is set up, you have 2 different years, 2 different types of times a year. So everyone was originally set up with a January 1st growth date. So basically what it said is you're allowed to capture all growth from the end of last fiscal year or in this case, the January 1st previous day all the way up to January 1st currently. So looking at January 1st, 2023, all the way up to January 1st, 2024. So that full year. There was some legislation that allowed communities to advance that. That's under Chapter 653, and that would allow you to take growth all the way up to June 30th. So their year would actually run from July 1st the previous year all the way to June 30th. So they could capture time. So depending on what you have for local options in your community, those are your 2 different growth dates. That's used for the calculation for Prop 2.5. You're allowed to go over your allowed levy by the growth amount. So if you go to your levy calculation sheet in Gateway, you can see how your growth number impacts the amount of money you can take in through taxation. So the next point is July 1st, 2024. For fiscal 25, that was the start of the fiscal year. So in theory, people can start submitting. Not every community does it. It's very rare. One of the communities that we have outlined in previous webinars was Yarmouth. Yarmouth starts historically very, very early. I believe they've been the first community to submit values. Traditionally, values are set, starting at the end of the summer, early fall, but you can submit July 1st if everything's ready. So looking at the most popular kind of times, values are sent to us. So that could be the sales analysis, which is the LA3 form. That could be the LA4, which is the totals per class. So a lot of that information is starting to come into us starting in August, all the way up to October 1st, and actually going into November and October, later October as well. So from there, once all the sales are approved, that's the LA3 process. Once the values are approved, which is the LA4 process. If you're in a cert year, we approve your certs. The next step is going to a classification hearing. So now you have all your values. Now you have how you can divide your levy equally into your tax assessments, and kind of calculate what the tax bill would be, what the tax rate would be, what tax policies you want. So when the values are done, you kind of shift gears over to preparing for the classification hearing. The classification hearing takes what is allowed by Prop 2.5, so the max that you can take in a certain year. It brings in the valuations that were approved by the Division of Local Services, Bureau of Local Assessment. And then you start looking at the allowable shifts under Mass General laws. So some of those shifts are, do you want a commercial rate? Do you want to have tax policy like a residential exemption? Are you looking for a senior means exemption? Do you want a small commercial exemption? There's all these different kind of things that happen at a classification hearing. So once you have your values approved, once you know what you can take in legally by Prop 2.5, the next step is to have your classification hearing. Once the classification hearing is over, the elected officials vote on it. The next step is to submit your recap and submit information to the Bureau of Accounts. That information goes into Gateway, and roughly, you get your tax rate November 1st or later, but that's the next step. That tax rate needs to be approved before you can do your tax billing. So what we're seeing is a trend of, people submitting or starting the process, late November, even mid-November. And then what happens is some unforeseen circumstance comes up. Someone gets sick, someone's on vacation, something happens which delays information getting to us. So I think it's really good for each community to understand when you're submitting things. And if you look down at the bottom, we did our best to kind of color code things. So looking at the kind of metrics on the bottom as far as submissions, anything in blue, you can plan on 1, 2, 3 different delays. And I'll name very common delays. Trying to get your classification hearing, meeting posted. So you might have bylaws to say you have to post any city council or select board meeting 2 weeks in advance. You might have a delay based on the financial system you use might have an update. You might have an issue with your billing file. That's very common. And then the third most common one is just the time. You're looking at the whole finance department. So anything in blue, you can absorb 2 or 3 different things that are happening. You have plenty of time before the 31st of December to get your tax bills out in a quarterly count. Once you start getting into October, as far as starting the process, which again, on average takes 51 days, you might only be able to handle 1 or 2 setbacks. If it's a big setback, like we're seeing some financial updates in the software system taking a week or so. That's very common to happen, and it has happened. So you can have 1 or 2 things that take some time and still get your tax bills out. The last color we're looking at is the red color. On our side, it's extremely stressful because, again, the time of year, you're looking at holidays, limited staff, you're looking at workloads for all different things, that you are risking not sending tax bills out or missing something. Just because you get things done in Gateway doesn't mean you're not going to have an issue with liens or something in the tax billing process after you get things through Gateway. So again, in order to plan things out, I think, understanding how your town operates or city operates and coming up with a plan to allow maybe a week or two buffer, starting things earlier. It doesn't have to be a drastic change, but the longer that you go, if something happens, you risk not sending tax bills out timely. So tax bills going out, I think the assessors are tasked with fair and equitable assessments. So what does that mean? Not only the value being fair, but also equitable. And what does that mean? So in theory, with fair and equitable, what you're looking at is if a house is across the street from another house and they're very similar, the valuation and the change should be very similar to them. So when it was explained to me when I started assessing, I think a lot of people call it the log cabin theory. So a log cabin that's built on one side of the jurisdiction would be valued, based on the building tables the same in another part. It might have a different land value because of the neighborhood, the size of the lot, but there's consistency if that log cabin is exact. I think I started out with this webinar saying trying to find two houses that are exact is almost impossible. Even with condos in the same building, there's slight variances in square footage, layout, maybe the grade of construction with kitchens or bathrooms. So even though things are very similar, they might be slightly different. But in theory, the model should value them differently. So if you had two identical houses built at the same time, same style, same builder, across the street from each other, they might have a slight variation. For instance, one might be 1 acre as far as the land size, one might be 1.25 acre. So there'll be a slight increase as far as land area. And then on the building side, they might be the same builder, but maybe one of the kitchens was at a higher grade. Maybe they spent more money to have a upgraded kitchen. Maybe they finished the basement or the attic. So those slight variations in the model would be adjusted for. But if it's the same house across the street on the same land and everything's the same, there should be consistency with the valuation and the adjustments every year. So when the sales happen and you have a house that sells, say it's a colonial in a certain neighborhood, the model should be driven so that when you adjust those valuations based off that sale, that all those like properties are adjusted equitably so that that model is driving the cost. You're not going into that specific valuation and just increasing it on that one house. You're using the tables and the models to drive those valuations. So this is crucial for public trust. I think every assessor can talk about, they have someone that comes to the counter, the actual tax bills go out. The first thing they start to do is name 3, 4, 5 properties in their neighborhood or maybe in the jurisdiction that are very similar. They want to print out the field cards, which a property record card has all the information. It has a, building photo, a sketch, has all the information on it. And what they do is they go line by line and they want to compare their house with what they perceive as comparable. Sometimes they compare, a Cape with a colonial or some house that's, built in 1980s to a new construction. Very easy to go through and find out why those valuations are different. But if they're comparing, a 1985 construction colonial with another 1985 construction colonial, there should be some similarities as far as evaluations. There might be a change or a subjective change based on grade of construction, maybe depreciation, which is the upkeep of a property. So if someone's not maintaining it, there might be a lower value based on, just needing updates compared to something that has constant permits and is kind of kept as a newer structure, even though it was originally built older. So there's all these adjustments, but the taxpayer is going to print out all these cards. And if there is the exact same house that they're comparing, the public trust is not going to be there. So this is something that assessors do. They want to compare different things. They want to use tables to adjust everything. And they constantly want to be reviewing all the adjustments that are used in the jurisdiction. This requires going out in the field. An assessor should not only be in the office. As they're driving out in the field to do inspections, as they're driving out in the field to look at properties that sold, they're driving through neighborhoods. They're looking at permit activity. They're looking at grading, construction. I joke and say, once you're assessor, you can't shut it off. So I would say my wife does not want to hear when we're driving into a new jurisdiction and I'm noticing different housing types or I'm noticing different assessing things and I comment on it. I think that's kind of the sickness part of it is assessors have that. They're always looking at value. They're always looking at properties. And that should happen when you go out. So if you're going out to a permit or an assessor's going out in the field, they're looking through all the houses, all the properties leading up to that inspection. And that is part of the process. COVID definitely has impacted the comfort level of people allowing you to go into houses, but you still have to make the attempt as an assessor to go in because one of the largest increases on property record cards is finished living area that can only be checked by going to that house and trying to gain access. So do they have a finished attic? Do they have a finished basement? You can't tell that from aerial photography, from a lot of the tools that you can use on the desktop. But when you go out to the property, you can see different characteristics. You should constantly be trying to find out is things are things correct? Is the attic finished? Is the basement finished? That is part of the job of an assessor is to constantly check that. Unfortunately, not everyone pulls permits. And if that information is not captured, you are essentially shifting the tax burden to other people. It's not that they're getting a break. You're shifting that tax burden to someone else that doesn't deserve it. So assessors are tasked with going to properties, not just to go out in the field and assess from their car, but to measure the properties, to try and gain access, to review what's in there, and ensure what is in the system is correct. So that's part of a fair and equitable system, and assessors are doing that constantly all throughout the year. So why do you want to go out to verify the data? Why do you want to go out to, what seems like do a lot of work? Why can't we use, Google Earth? Why can't we use, some of these tools? Because there's the appeal process. So the taxpayer has the right every time there's new values to appeal the values. They're going to use your information and what's in your camera model against you. They're going to say, I have this comp, it's assessed at this, but it's not that. They're going to find all these different things. So that the appeal process sometimes the taxpayer won't appeal if everyone's the same. If they go through a process and they say, I don't like the value that the assessor put on the property, but I looked at what I deemed was peer properties and they went up the same as my property. So you know what? I researched it. I'm not going to file an appeal. Or they could have the opposite experience. They could find out that they just bought their house. The valuation was adjusted to the market value on their house, but across the street, there's a value that didn't change. The model did not reflect a change in unsold properties. That's going to trigger an appeal, and that's going to be hard to defend locally and at the appellate tax board. So ensuring the accuracy of the data, going out in the field, having the assessor involved with the model and understanding the model should limit the appeals to values because statutorily, every property owner has that right to appeal. And the more the data is not verified and accurate, the assessing department is going to lose at the local appeal or at the appellate tax board. So to explain the appeal process, taxpayers can file written applications. There's a whole process for that. The local board has to act on it. I would say the best practices for assessors is to inspect every year that you have it. So even if they filed last year, you have to ensure that nothing's changed. So going out to review, to inspect appeals every year should be a good process, just in case something was demolished, if something was added or something was changed from unfinished to finished. You want to make sure that the appeal process is acting on the most accurate information. You might also want to go out and inspect what they gave you for comparables. Maybe the assessment information is not correct. So there's a whole abatement process that's handled locally with the Board of Assessors. We have a lot of guidance on that. If the local Board of Assessors does not act on it or they deny it, that application can go by law to the appellate tax board to the next level. And there's a whole defined process for that. But we do have values that are appealed every year in jurisdictions. So the Board of Assessors reviews applications. The assessing staff might be tasked with going out in the field. I've worked in offices where the assessing staff did all the inspections. I've worked in offices where the Board of Assessors wants to come out to those appeal inspections. So judging by the resources assessors have in their own offices and what the policies are for the abatement process in each office, you might have the board go out, it might be the assessor, it might be a vendor going out. So that could be 351 different ways looking at all the local boards. As far as actions, the board can grant, it can deny, can partially grant, or can even take no action. So there's all different things that happen depending on what time you have, what information you have. The board might decide not to take action based on time constraints. There is a running clock that's going on for action on these appeals. Everything is expressed. I'll go over some resources to get very granular information on this appeal process, but the board is tasked with those things. They have to have meetings and there's a whole process for that. And then again, the taxpayers can appeal the local boards. They can appeal the appellate tax board. There's a whole process past the local appeal process. So the Bureau of Local Assessment, in my mind, plays a crucial oversight and support role for assessors. As you can see, there's just a lot going on in assessing offices. We do have the 101 course that gives you the foundation of what happens for assessments, but by no means is that the end of education for anyone that's actively going to set values in a community. There's many trade organizations, whether it's the IAAO, the MAAO, the Appraisal Institute. There's all further education. And in my opinion, that's required. There's so many different valuations that assessors do that are very niche. Looking at personal property, looking at valuing utilities, looking at valuing large commercial properties. There's so many things that assessors, Board of Assessors, and vendors are tasked with that require very specialized training. So although we provide regulatory kind of training, process training as far as gateway, there is a whole appraisal side of this that I encourage everyone, if that's your career path, to explore, but also to ask yourself, how do we value those properties locally? You are responsible one way or another to value those properties. If you keep a flat value on a property, that is a valuation decision. So for instance, if there is a certain property that did not change from year to year and everything else changed, you are taking that tax burden and shifting it to all the properties that have changed. So by keeping a value the same consistently year to year, that is a valuation decision. There is impacts to it, especially with residential properties. Residential, it's not unheard of to go up 10, 20, 30% in 1 year. That's dynamically going to change the tax burden to those properties that did not change. So again, keeping an assessment flat for any given year, you are essentially shifting that tax burden to all the valuations that have changed. And inverse, if you're decreasing a valuation, you're also doing that. So in a CAMA model, you might have certain values going up, certain values flattening out, and certain values dropping. That happens. Not everything is going to go up 5%. The residential is not going to track with the commercial. The commercial is not going to track with personal property. There's all these different things. Every year you have to go through the exercise of what would that property sell for on the assessment date from a willing buyer, willing seller. What is the value of that property for all properties? So that is very important to understand. You cannot just leave things flat. You have to go through the process for all property because it does shift the tax burden, whether you know it or not. So as far as BLA, we look at, setting standards, providing training, conducting certification programs. We also monitor local assessment practices, attending webinars like this just to get a better understanding of what an assessor, the role of assessor does, what's the role of BLA or DLS, consistent training. I will say probably the best pathway to success in assessing is always keep on training. Jen has done a great job. DLS has really pushed out a lot of resources. We have webinars all the time. That is part of assessing. If there's a subject matter that assessors want training on, we will provide it if we have the resources or work with the trade organizations to get that training out there. So my thought is we're going to have a lot of these webinars. This starts with just the basic role of an assessor, but we have a lot of other things that we can definitely put forward. Another thing that kind of has changed in the last few years is we're publishing all of the data. You can use data from your peer communities to find out, we went up 5% this year. How did the towns around us, did they go up 5%? Did they go up 10%? Did they stay flat? So all of the data that you submit to us, we have the ability to give it back to you to kind of evaluate maybe your community over a certain time frame, or maybe looking at peer communities. We have some very in-depth dashboards where we aggregate all that data and we kind of build out visualizations to make the end user informed without going through all the coding and organizing. So there's three kind of different ways to extract the information. You can go into Gateway, pull it kind of manually. You can go to the DARB report page and you can pull out, PDF formats of it. Or the third way of using it is you can go to some of our dashboards that are built for assessing, and you can start just kind of playing around with the interactive software that's web-based that's available. So you can start really looking at how is this year compared to my peers? How is this year compared to the previous years? And I think this is really helpful insight to find out how things are tracking with your community and everything else across the Commonwealth. And again, we're also help with, revaluation plans. So there's a lot of resources on the 5th year when BLA comes into a community. So if anyone has any questions, whether it's based on staffing, budgets, what's needed for a certification, we help define that plan for assessors and for communities. And then we establish a timeline. So those are ongoing things for roughly 70 communities every year, but we do provide those resources. So some very just big high level things. Certification, I call it a deep audit of the model of assessing. And again, it's done every 5 years. There is an advisor that comes in. The advisors have anywhere from 3 to 5 communities every year, sometimes maybe even more. But what they're really doing is looking at the model to make sure that the properties are reflecting the current market conditions. So increasing land values, building values, or even decreasing. Assessments don't always go up. Sometimes they flatten, sometimes they go down. So that 5th year allows BLA staff to go in to evaluate it. We also look at the inspections. Every 10 years, you should be going out. You have to go out to every property. A good best practice is to go out to properties every year, do 10% of the community every year. Specialize going to, permit properties and sale properties, and then what properties you haven't visited. But by doing it at 10% every year, one, you have all the changes, whether they're permitted or not. So that helps with your growth numbers. 2, it helps you with your sales analysis because you're reviewing those sales in the field. And then number 3, it spreads that cost out over 10 years. It's not unheard of to have property inspections anywhere from, $25 to $30 to $50 per parcel. That's a lot of money if you're doing it once every 10 years. And I would argue the quality of the data that you get from doing everything at once is not nearly as good as small batches coming in every year. So by going to 10% of the community every year, you maximize your growth, you validate your sales, and you spread that cost out. If anyone wants more information on that, I am more than happy to explain that. When I was on the other side working in communities, I did that. I inherited that process from a couple of communities, and it was extremely successful to have accurate assessments, but also to maximize growth and ensure really quality market data. One of the other things we do, and this impacts local receipts, but we do an equalizing of all valuations. So there's different assessment levels that are allowed by law. It's 90 to 110%. But every 2 years, we level that. We bring everyone up to the same level of assessment. And there's a whole defined process. More than happy to provide those resources. But that is one of the roles of an assessor, is to look at it and just to understand what's happening, because it does impact, state aid and other county taxes. So this is a slide that I built. I actually had a webinar from the MMA for managers. And what I wanted to do is kind of, in my opinion, put what the benefits are of having, very, proficient assessing practices, and what could it impact in a jurisdiction. So assessing operations, having, a proficient assessment administration. So having a plan in place, doing your inspections, going through how you arrive at your value, how you test your model, that is extremely important. Having fair and equitable assessments, making sure that, every year you're going through all property types and you're really keeping up with what the values are from year to year. And you're not really letting certain property types that might be hard to value stay the same. And then good assessment data, going out in the field, using market validation software. So looking at property sales, or looking at building permits, zoning changes, really testing that model and having an accurate model. Good assessment data provides good, fair, and equitable assessments. So if that doesn't happen, what is impacted? Assessments are used for tax policy. So if you're looking for a residential exemption, if you're looking for, certain tax policy, they're going to look at impacts. And if your assessments are not in line with where they should be, that could jeopardize local tax policy. It can definitely jeopardize Prop 2.5 votes. So if you're looking at debt exclusions, if you're looking at overrides, and you have an assessment system that has a lot of incorrect data or things that are not fair and equitable, that could really impact that vote for Prop 2.5, for overrides, debt exclusions. So the first thing people are going to look at, how much is it going to cost to me? What is assessing? That's the funny thing with Prop 2.5 votes. Everyone starts looking at the assessing database. Assessors publish that information every year, but based on the activity on assessing websites, there is a huge spike in people looking at different valuations for Prop 2.5 votes. And then again, taxpayer trust, just believing in a fair tax bill or tax process. So if they don't have trust, they might not be in favor of budget items. It might impact, other things for communities. So if there's not a trust where, assessors are doing a good job, that could definitely hurt any budgetary items, definitely Prop 2.5, and then just local tax policy. So some challenging things that are happening just in assessing in general, just keeping pace. Assessors, I'll name some examples, battery storage, solar panels, windmills, large infrastructure, utility infrastructure projects. Assessors have to value everything. It's really, really hard to keep up pace. There's so many niche things that they have to do. And to top off, Massachusetts is one of the most dynamic, regions as far as changing values. The Cape, I think, tracked having 20% increases multiple years in a row. I think out in the western part of the state, they had a year of 20% increases. It's really hard to have those changes and keep up with that with just what's happening out there with the real estate market. So keeping pace is hard for assessors. Managing the increasing data and technology requirements. There was a point in time where assessing was done on paper. Now we have systems in place, and I think all the assessment systems in the state are going through modernization, different approaches. It's really important for assessors to know how their system operates, how to run reports, how to extract data out of it. That is something that's added on to the assessing function. And I think in previous years, you could have one person in the office that was really good with computers. Now it's kind of a requirement for all assessing functions. Everything's digital, everything's stored in that database. Addressing concerns and appeals. Sometimes if you have a, Prop 2.5 vote, you might have 200 appeals that come in because people don't understand the assessment process. They're using the assessment appeal process to kind of say, I don't want to pay for an override or debt exclusion. So just addressing the high volume of appeals that can happen in an assessing office, building up your website. There's a lot of concerns, and that's a good segue to say you should have on your assessing webpage the 5 or 10 most common questions asked about assessing. Use your website as a 24/7 resource for answering things. The newer generation will go to that site. They don't want to call. They don't want to send an email. If they can find their answer on that website, they won't call, which will cut down on resources. So definitely leverage the assessing website and try and answer the most 5 or 10 common questions. So ensuring, accurate valuations, we definitely discussed that, and staffing levels and resources. There's certain, things that you can't do in-house. If you have a smaller jurisdiction, you might not have the luxury of having a full-time data collector. So you're constantly going back and forth with, do we have this in-house or do we hire out? What do we need for services? What is the assessor comfortable with? So that's that kind of back and forth. And I think throughout the state, there's a balance of things they can do in-house and then things they hire out for. But that's a changing kind of thing from year to year. Some of the good resources that DLS has, and I encourage everyone after this to go on to find out the role of the assessor. So if you go to the training and resource link, you'll see that there's a web page, and I don't even know if you printed it out, maybe 15 pages of every single assessing video, every single resource that we have geared to specific topics. If it is not there, let Jen and I know, because we want this to be everything. And that's based on some of the feedback we've heard from assessors. They're looking for all of the information. So videos, guidelines, legal stuff, standards, PowerPoints, everything in one place. This is the place for the role of the assessor, and Jen and her team have done an unbelievable job at kind of corralling all that information, and it's just geared to assessing. So again, everything should be there. If it's not, let us know. Definitely use our website. And then the other thing too is to have a look at our visualizations. We have a annual visualization that comes out that's very high level. I believe there's over 12 or 13 different slides on it. But what it does is it allows you to look through, I believe, at least 5 years worth of information for assessment trends. You can look at the whole state. You can look at your specific community. So please, I encourage everyone to go kind of this section of the website. If anyone needs help navigating it, I think we can follow up with with some links after this. But we're constantly building resources, not only for the tech proficient people, but also, a prepackaged dashboard so that anyone can click through it. We take, I think in this project, I want to say there's 20 different reports over 5 different years, millions of points of data, and we basically package it to make it interactive. That is extremely important for us, and we will have more and more of these visualizations so that you don't have to be, a dashboard expert. That if you have deficiencies with Excel or don't know Power BI, we will build it. So any feedback, constructive, positive or negative, is welcomed. But I just want to make sure that everyone knows about that resource. It could be very helpful for assessors. At this point, I just want to thank everyone. I think it's extremely important to have these webinars. Extremely excited to kind of break down what the role of the assessor is and have it at a very high level. I appreciate everyone here and everyone taking time to have professional development. And again, Jen will send something out. At this point, I can open it up to some questions, just some guidelines on the questions. If they're too specific, I might not answer them. Feel free to reach out to your advisor if I don't get to them, or myself. I just don't want to get into too many specifics. I want to keep it very high level for this webinar. Thank you, everyone.
So Chris, we have 8 questions, so I'll have you take a look at them now while I give some information to folks. Let them know that I will be following up with an email directly to everyone that will include a recording of the webinar. It will include the links that we shared today, and it'll include the presentation. So you'll have all this information. I probably won't get it to you. My goal is by next Friday, but it could be the following week because I am out a day or two next week. So, but my goal is to get it out usually within a week. So you can rest assured it'll go directly to whatever email you registered with in about a week.
Awesome. So I think I have a few questions from Peter, so I'm going to try and work through them. So as far as is it possible that the fair share is not directly proportionate to property value? There are local tax policy options. So for instance, you can shift the tax rate for certain commercial, industrial, and personal property. You can also have things like small commercial exemption. You can have the residential exemption, where what it does is it shifts the tax burden onto defined classes by property classes by mass general laws. So in the example of the residential exemption, it takes all residential properties. It defines what is owner occupied, what qualifies, and it basically increases the tax rate in order to pay for the discount for all properties that qualify. So there's definitely a shift as far as tax burden in the residential class. I'd say the most common tax burden shift is the residential rate. So there is the ability at the classification hearing for communities to adopt a higher rate for commercial, industrial, and personal property. If they did not adopt that, they would have the same tax rate for all properties. So in order to have a proportional or a tax burden shift, you would have to use one of the defined tax policy decisions that at the classification hearing. We have very in-depth articles on that, so I encourage you, Peter, to look out and feel free to ask your advisor or myself any follow-up questions. Let's see. So as far as any changes to income, would that be growth? No, any changes to valuation based on market conditions are not growth. The easy way to think of growth, growth is taxed for the first time. It's not a change based solely on value. So the advisor, as part of the growth process, will qualify or unqualify specific growth projects. But if someone came in and said, the market went up 20%, I'm going to capture that for whatever property type, that would not be considered growth. Growth would be you added a garage to a property. It didn't exist before. It received taxation for the first time. That's considered growth. As far as the recap sheet, the recap is what the formal process is. It's a recapitulation sheet. So it takes the valuations, the tax rates, applies all revenue sources, and basically goes through all the financials. You should have access to the recap sheet for your community. Feel free, Peter, to work with your assessor to get a copy to better understand it. I think that looking at the actual recap sheet would explain the process a little better, but it's the overall financials presented to the Bureau of Accounts for each community. As far as using AI, not that I know in Massachusetts. Oh, this is a great question. So is the assessor's duty to fully explain an abatement in the appeal process to a taxpayer, or is it the responsibility of the taxpayer to educate themselves? As I said here, one of the roles of the assessor is to explain, how the valuations are. So based on volume, can they have, 2, 3, 4 hours with each taxpayer to go over the abatement process, the valuation process? I think there is that boundary as far as giving resources and to walk through line by line. In my assessment career, there's obviously different learning styles, different expectations as far as what's explained. Some taxpayers might require basically a full appraisal on why their value should or shouldn't be valued that way. I think that's unrealistic to ask for every abatement to go that level. But I do believe an assessor should provide the overall resources on how an assessment is arrived at, some resources on market sales, and some taxpayer guidance as far as the appeal process. As far as the appeal process, there are a lot of resources on the DLS webpage. So if you go to the role of the assessor, there's a whole abatement process, and I would say that defines most of the questions that are asked by taxpayers. If you go to the Appellate Tax Board, they have a whole bunch of resources there. As far as the standards, as far as how we assess things, there's a multiple page document. There's many videos to explain that. So an assessor could provide that by just sending a link or those resources. Do they have to go line by line? I would hope they would do that when it warrants it, but there is a balance of providing service like that to everyone and understanding that one assessor might have 12,000 taxpayers, and it's hard for them to provide that level to everyone. But I would say most assessors go over and above explaining things and educating as part of their job. Some due diligence on the taxpayer to reach out to or to visit DLS. There's a lot of really good resources, which I use because things like Prop 2.5, it's really hard to explain that in 2 minutes. It's really hard. Well, we have a video for that. So there's a lot of resources that DLS has that are not only helpful to public officials, to assessors, but also taxpayers. As far as further education past the 101, trade organizations like Appraisal Institute, International Assessing Association, the Mass Association of Assessing Officers, those are 3 off the top of my head. There's a lot of valuation classes that are out there. We have webinars. There's a lot of free webinars that are out there. So I think there's a lot of resources, but those are 3 of the most common that are out there. All right, so great question by Jim as far as what can the board play in assessing operations as far as signing off on things, what training is available. So the Board of Assessors is defined all over. There is no finite, this is the Board of Assessors. So for instance, the extremes, you could have in a community, and this does exist, where one person is the Board of Assessors, the assessor, and the clerk. They do all functions of the assessing office. So to answer the question for that, they should be receiving training. They're doing the abatement, they're doing everything. So in that situation, the board should have all sorts of training. They shouldn't just take the 101. I mean, they should work on getting advanced training past the 101, and they're responsible for all facets of assessing. On the other side, there's the extremes. Boston, for instance, I believe they have over 60 people at least in their office. So they might have one person that just does condominiums or excise. And they might have a board that has multiple levels of staff under them. So their board might be very um, uh, they might have minimal responsibilities. More commonly, a board in a mid-size or even smaller communities is an oversight role. So they come in to go through the abatement process. They sign off on all values. The one thing that you really have, the takeaway from what you're signing up as a board member is you are the one submitting things in Gateway. You should have whatever works for you in your community, a review process. Your name is assigned to those values, to growth, signing the recap sheet. So if you don't know, you should have that discussion with either other board members or your assessing staff. Who is responsible for what? How are we verifying it? Because the board is responsible for signing off in Gateway, and they are the last line of defense as far as values going in to tax bills going out. So more than happy to help with resources, but you should have that conversation locally. And there is no one, there's defined sizes of boards, but it could be one person all the way up to 60 people as far as the overall assessing operation. As far as factors used to test the model, the best thing I would do is go to our standards. I believe Jen has provided that link. So look at the standards, but also talk to your vendors or understand how your model works. If you're the assessor in that community, that is your job to understand how that model works. You have to explain that to your board. You have to explain it to the assessors. You shouldn't have a disconnect from what the vendors do. Although they might come in to adjust your models, you should know how things are and you should build up that knowledge. Every model is different in every community. So just because you have one product doesn't mean that operates in all the communities the same way. You have the ability to make that product work uniquely in your community. So have those discussions with the assessor, the board, and vendors on who's monitoring it and how do you explain it. That is something that is crucial to understand how assessments are applied uniformly. As far as how to avoid the appellate tax board, I think the easiest way is to have accurate data and have a process in place that you ensure accurate data. I think over the years, a lot of the appeals come from not having inspections, not knowing how to adjust things, not seeing things. So going out in the field, constantly testing your models is a good way to avoid the appellate tax board. As far as taking things out of Chapter 1, please follow up with your advisor. We do have resources, but I don't want to get into the details on that. Definitely follow up with your advisor. So as far as definition of different codes, yes, everything in a CAMA model has codes and it's unique to your community, whether it's building types, inspection codes, land types, even property land use codes. There is a table that's in there that the assessors can provide, whether you're a board member or you request that information. We do not. We actually have the opposite of copyright restrictions. We encourage you to steal our stuff. Um, again, we have an unbelievable resource as far as the videos, a lot of the guidance. It is, vetted through legal. It is really high level. It is hard to explain in a soundbite what Prop 2.5 is. You can embed videos into your website. You can take sections of our guidance. Absolutely. That is what that is there for. So if there's any questions, let us know. But if you change the tone of it, so if you take something and modernize it, that probably is not the best thing to do. But if you take it verbatim or attach it as a resource, we encourage you to borrow our information, our materials. Yeah, the last question, as far as desktop appraisal or using aerial photography, I would look at our standards to answer that. Aerial photography is not to a survey standard. So without boring everyone with details, there's a curvature of the Earth. There's some calculations that have to be made as far as when you take an airplane that's flying at a certain height, taking pictures of the ground, there's certain calculations that have to be made. That your question as far as aerial survey to adjust land area is more of a question for your engineering department or someone that a surveyor. So I would reach out to your engineering department to ask that question. I think it's over and above the assessing function, and by using aerial photography exclusively to adjust land area, you might not be doing things depending on what aerial survey software you use. So that's a engineering or DPW question or a surveyor question. And I think that for the most part wraps up all the questions. So again, I want to thank everyone for jumping on. We can definitely have more webinars that are in the weeds. So Jen will be sending out a survey, and I encourage everyone to fill out anything they liked, anything they'd like to see. And I appreciate everyone's time, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'll follow up with an email in a week or so.